Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Game of Thrones Season 2. This is the second in a series of videos where I go back and cover earlier seasons of Game of Thrones that I have not previously covered because they aired before my channel started. So I'm going to give a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to Season 2. If you haven't seen all of Season 2, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. However, if you haven't seen beyond Season 2, not to worry, there will not be spoilers for later seasons until the end of the video, where I will give a proper spoiler warning before I start talking about later seasons. So until then, you are safe, and I will just focus on Season 2. So I can't talk about Season 2 without mentioning the popular opinion on it, because this is probably one of the biggest examples of where my opinion diverges greatly from the popular opinion, as I still to this day see many YouTubers, reviewers, commenters, and everyone state that Season 2 is the worst season of Game of Thrones, and that is a statement I could not possibly disagree with more. Before Season 4 aired, I proudly stated that Season 2 was my favorite season of Game of Thrones, but as it stands now, I'd say Seasons 2, 4, and 6 are my favorite seasons. So I kind of look at Game of Thrones seasons the way most people would look at Star Trek movies, where I prefer the even-numbered ones to the odd-numbered ones. But of course, there is no such thing as a bad season of Game of Thrones, as it's all awesome. But to me, Seasons 2, 4, and 6 are just pure gold and do stand out slightly more than the others. And choosing between them is kind of like a Sophie's choice for me, as they're all really awesome. But historically, I always chose Season 4 as the best. However, after Season 6 aired, I stated that that was my second best, but after watching Season 2 again, I may reconsider that and say Season 2 is my second favorite, but it doesn't matter. The point is, I love Season 2. Now, I can't entirely fathom why Season 2 is looked on so poorly. Most explanations I heard from people who didn't like Season 2 always involved the books somehow, either complaints of things being adapted poorly or left out entirely. I personally believe this springs from two things. One, a large number of people who read the books did so after watching Season 1 and thus judged Season 2 more harshly as an adaptation where they did not do this with Season 1. And two, because Season 1 followed the book so closely, and Season 2 is where they started to diverge from the source material. Now, I myself saw Season 2 before reading the book, so my leanings may favor the show as it was my first introduction, but regardless, I largely disagree with these opinions. I won't get too much into how I think Season 2 compares to the novels it's based on, as I already did an entire video about that, which I'll leave a link to in the description below for those interested. Suffice to say, there are some things I thought were greatly improved from the novels, such as the Daenerys and Arya storylines, which I thought were way more interesting in the show, and there were some storylines that the show botched and didn't do as well as the book, such as the Jon Snow and Theon storylines. Either way, I have yet to hear a reason on why Season 2 is the worst season that has nothing to do with the books. And since I firmly believe any show should be judged on its own merits and not compared to its source material, then I don't really consider those valid reasons at all. But that's just my opinion. If someone watching this does have reasons on why they think Season 2 is the worst season of Game of Thrones that have absolutely nothing to do with the books, I would love to hear about it. But I doubt I'd agree with you, because I love this season, but I'd still like to hear about it regardless. So enough of the preamble, let me get into examining Season 2, which I'll do episode by episode, starting with the premiere episode, The North Remembers. This I thought worked well as an introductory episode for Season 2, as it set up all the storylines of the show quite nicely. Even the storylines started to splinter off at the end of Season 1. I found this was the real beginning of the show's format that would follow for many seasons to come, of bouncing back between multiple storylines that had nothing to do with each other. I found the storylines here were more numerous and independent from each other than they were in Season 1. I quite liked this format and thought it worked well for the show. This episode introduced us to the Stannis storyline that brings with it characters like Davos and Melisandre. So even though when I first saw Season 2, I hadn't read the books, I did watch a featurette prior to watching the season about some of the newer characters that were being introduced in Season 2, and they talked about Balon Greyjoy and Stannis. Now, I actually remembered Stannis from the many mentions in Season 1 where Ned kept talking about Stannis being the true true heir to the throne. But the way Stannis was described was as a rigid, hardened man who wasn't very friendly nor looked upon too kindly by the people of Westeros. And this introductory scene did a great job of portraying him in that way. And of course, it also introduces two important elements to his story, Davos and Melisandre. Melisandre would kind of define the type of person he is, as he's being manipulated by this priestess who has some magical powers, and that set up an interesting premise indeed. But on the other hand, we have Davos, a humble man from humble beginnings that is as devoted to Stannis as a man can be. And Davos was destined to be a fan favorite. And these scenes in this episode introduce all these complex factors beautifully in this episode, and the main point that Stannis was destined to take the throne and that he wouldn't make peace with anyone else. And I liked how this episode used the theme of the comet to tie all the storylines together. That made for a nice cinematic theme for this episode, and I absolutely love the scene where Robb talks to Jaime and Jaime tries to act all arrogant and like hot shit like he always does, but Robb puts him in his place by informing him about what Stannis is telling everybody about Cersei's children being his bastard children, and on top of that he brings Grey Wind, and who nearly snaps Jaime's head off, and I absolutely love this. It did nicely set up the dynamic that regardless of how arrogant Jaime acts, he is at Robb Stark's mercy, and Robb is indeed making leadway against the Lannisters. And this episode also introduced one of the best storylines the show has ever had, Tyrion serving as Hand of the King in King's Landing. In the scene where he informs Cersei he is to serve as Hand by interrupting a small council meeting was awesome indeed. This episode also features one of my favorite scenes where Littlefinger tries to taunt Cersei about her relationship with Jaime being made public by saying knowledge is power, and then Cersei responds. A response is to nearly have Littlefinger killed and then retort, power is power. That is such an awesome scene. Now, I heard some who read the books complain that the scene was totally out of character for Cersei. However, the caveat is it's out of character for book Cersei. And again, that's absolutely meaningless because it was totally in keeping with how Cersei had been portrayed on the show, and that is the only thing that matters. And this episode also introduced the character of Dolorous Ed and Gilly. Although they don't have much to do in this episode, Ed kind of just pops up as a good friend of Jon and Sam and Gren all of a sudden, so it wasn't until later that I realized this was actually a new character. And Gilly, I could tell they were setting up with something with her, I just wasn't sure what. And the episode had pretty exciting ending with a montage of all of Robert's bastards being killed and leaving it with, them looking for Gendry and then showing Gendry traveling on the road with Arya. It was quite ominous. So my rating for The North Remembers out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. A very effective first episode of the season that did a great job of introducing new characters and the new dynamics for established characters, and it featured some amazing scenes, so overall a very powerful start to the season. Next is the Nightlands, which doesn't really stand out as being a particularly good or bad episode. It's more of a cog in the machine that helps tell the story overall of Season 2. We get to see more of Arya and Gendry traveling together on the road, a nice little relationship they have, and the tension is raised when the Gold Cloaks come looking for them. Ended the episode nicely. And of course, this episode expands on Daenerys' situation being trapped in the Red Waste, which gets worse when her Blood Rider, who she sent out looking for the end of the Red Waste, returns with his head returns, I should say. This really raised the stakes of the story and outlined how hopeless her situation was. We see Sam start to form a connection with Gilly, which was nice, and we see Theon return to the Iron Islands. In some way, these scenes were hard to watch as Theon acts like such an arrogant moron. It's cringeworthy how naive he is as he ends up hitting on his own sister. However, the story did get quite powerful when his father was treating him like shit, and he points out that he was the one who abandoned him to the Stark, so it's kind of shitty for him to be treating Theon this way because of what he did. Also, I think Theon did a really shit job of trying to convince his father to make a pact with Robb rather than attacking the North. Again, Theon's just too big of a moron. This episode was one of the worst in terms of sexual gratuity. It had two of the worst scenes. One in the brothel where Littlefinger wipes cum off of a woman's face, who then immediately kisses another man. I heard someone describe the scene once as betraying Littlefinger purposely, as the way he's meant to be, because he gets off on doing something like that. I can kind of see that, but I really don't see that as necessary. I don't think we needed that scene. Nor was it, did we need the scene where Littlefinger threatened Rawls. And we got another scene with Theon having sex with a random girl on the boat, which was another example of sexposition as he explains what the Iron Islands are all about and what their culture is while he's having sex with this girl. This was a bit too gratuitous for me. And on top of that, we get another sex scene with Melisandre and Stannis. This one was okay, I guess, just, to show how much Stannis is under her spell. But this episode had two amazing scenes. The first one with Davos trying to convince Salladhor Saan to fight for them, and this character was quite charismatic and interesting to watch. And it's his little tirade about wanting to fuck the queen was hilarious. But the truly amazing scene of the episode was where Tyrion had dinner with Janos Slynt and outright insults him, and Janos says, "Oh, I won't sit here and have my honor questioned by an imp." And to which he replies, "I am not questioning your honor, sir. I'm denying its existence." What a fucking awesome line. This whole scene was great on how he sent Janos to the wall and made Bronn Lord Commander of the City Watch. Janos had a big part to play in betraying Ned, leading to his capture and eventual death, so it was so great indeed to see him get his comeuppance in the most witty way. So my rating for the Nightlands out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. So yeah, not a standout episode, mainly it just moves the story along, but it is quite nicely done with a couple of totally unforgettable scenes. So next is What Is Dead May Never Die, and I love this episode. There was a lot of great things in this episode, and it wasn't just about the Ironborn as the title would suggest, but we did get some interesting scenes in this episode where Theon is forced to choose between his blood and his adopted family, a very realistic and relatable choice. But Theon, the moron he is, of course chooses the wrong side, but of course Theon isn't the only moron here, as Balon is obviously being pig-headed and stubborn, letting his pride get the better of him rather than doing the smart thing. We also got to see Catelyn enter Renly's camp and are introduced to iconic characters of Margaery Tyrell and Brienne of Tarth, and I love these scenes. It was interesting seeing Renly, the type of king he would be, as he is naive and overconfident, but also a clear man of the people, someone who has the respect and love of the people. I would almost describe him as the JFK of Westeros, a comparison that follows through considering what happens to Renly eventually. And again, this is where the show goes beyond the books to show us what happened behind closed doors with Renly, Loras, and Margaery, and the problems Renly had at putting up this facade of being married to Margaery, but Margaery didn't care, as she just wanted to be queen. This helped establish that Margaery is all about pretense, so I loved these scenes. And it was interesting seeing Sansa interact with Myrcella and Tommen at dinner, as she was forced to put on an act that the naive children weren't aware of, and didn't know what she was going through. Even back then, they were building up Tommen to be a respectable boy, quite different than Joffrey, as when Cersei asks him if he'd like to see Joffrey kill Sansa's brother, he says no. So that was interesting, as was seeing Shae become Sansa's handmaiden. The two of them made a nice pair. It was interesting how it starts with Sansa taking her frustration out on Shae, but then until she realized what she was doing. And of course we get one of my favorite sequences in the entire series, where Tyrion tricks the three members of the Small Council by telling each of them he's sending Myrcella off to be married, but telling each one a different suitor. To test to see if they're going to tell Cersei. And the whole way this sequence was edited together, as each scene flowed seamlessly into the next, was absolutely awesome. And it was so great seeing Varys' reaction. In particular, the chemistry Tyrion and Varys has is amazing. I love when Tyrion said, The queen mustn't know, and Varys' response was, ooh, the queen mustn't know. I love conversations that begin this way. And the smirk on Tyrion's face when he said this was incredible. I must admit, the first time I saw this, I was still unable to keep track of all the names of all these characters, so I didn't recognize the suitors Tyrion was mentioning. It wasn't until years later I connected names like Theon and Robin Arryn to the characters that had already appeared on the show. And of course, this was the first time the Martells of Dorne were mentioned in the show, so there was nothing for me to recognize there. And of course, it was equally awesome seeing Tyrion deal with Maester Pycelle once he found out he was the one that betrayed him. It was so awesome the way Tyrion toyed with him. God, I can't stand Pycelle, so I really enjoyed this scene. Plus, I think this is Tyrion at his best. A lot of great lines in here, such as when Tyrion tells the Hill tribesmen to cut off Pycelle's manhood and feed it to the ghost, to which the tribesman responds by saying, oh, there's no goats, half-man, and Tyrion's response was, well, make do. And seeing that, the way Pycelle freaks out over that, it was so hilarious. Oh, I just love this scene. Plus, it was interesting seeing the contrast between the way Littlefinger and Varys respond to being lied to. I think it speaks a lot to their characters, as Littlefinger's response is to get really upset, whereas Varys has actually congratulated Tyrion for this and actually warmed to him because of this. And he realized that Tyrion would make a good hand after all, and the relationship would only grow from there for the rest of the season, which of course would become more important down the line. And in this episode, we get the line in the series that perfectly sums up the show, or at the very least the season, as Varys gives the riddle about 3 powerful men in a room with a sellsword, and who each bid the sellsword to kill the other. The point of the riddle being, power resides where men believe it resides. Such wisdom that I firmly believe dictates the entire show and how one should look at it. And then the episode ends with the birth of Arya's death list, when Yoren tells her the story of how he said the name of his brother's murderer every night before he went to sleep as a sort of prayer, a practice Arya took up, and the whole sequence with the Night's Watch group getting attacked by the Lannister soldiers was intense, and indeed a great way to end the episode. So my rating for What Is Dead May Never Die out of 10 is a 10. The best. I absolutely love this episode. The Tyrion scenes alone make this episode great and among my favorite scenes in the whole series, but on top of that, we get great scenes with Arya, Renly, and Theon, and are introduced to iconic characters like Brienne and Marjorie. A really landmark episode. So next is Garden of Bones, an interesting episode as we get to see Robb Stark make headway in the Westerlands, and this is another thing we didn't really get in the books, as we only hear about it through hearsay, and we're introduced to Talisa Makier, the woman who obviously was to become Robb Stark's love interest, but I think they set up for this nicely. And we get another great Tyrion scene where Joffrey's having Sansa beaten in the throne room, but Tyrion strolls in and puts a stop to it. Again, more great Tyrion lines. When Ser Meryn warns Tyrion not to threaten the king, Tyrion responds by saying, I wasn't threatening the king, I was educating my nephew. Bronn, if Ser Meryn speaks again, kill him. That was a threat. See the difference? That was so awesome. And on top of that, we get the great scene where Tyrion uses his wit to blackmail Lancel and get him to become his personal spy, which was, again, awesome. I mean, honestly, these Tyrion scenes alone rule out this season for being considered for one of the worst seasons, in my opinion. So we get more of Renly's camp as we see Littlefinger arrives, and his interactions with Renly, Marjorie, and Catelyn were all interesting, and it was great to see Catelyn recognize that he betrayed her husband and hold him with the appropriate amount of disdain. And of course, we get the epic parlay between Stannis and Renly, where Renly rightfully lays out that no one wants Stannis to be king, but Stannis remains rigid in his resolve even in the face of superior numbers. Catelyn tries to speak sense to both of them, but of course is ignored. So sad to see what could have been avoided had these two brothers not been so pig-headed. And we get introduced to another witty character that I love, one who wasn't in the books, that is the Spice King, who is a member of the ruling council of Karth, known as the 13, who Daenerys negotiates with to arrange entry. But the Spice King is a dick to her and uses his wit to shun her, which is quite an interesting scene because, of course, as this episode made clear, to be refused entry means certain death. And of course, Daenerys does gain entry as Zarazan Doxos vouches for her, and it's obvious from the beginning that he has his own agenda, which I'm curious of. When the Spice King requested to see the dragons, why she refused him. Her refusal was the main reason he denied her entry. So basically, she almost got them all killed because she was being too stubborn. But I suppose it only goes to illustrate how naive she was at this point. And I can't stress enough how much better these scenes were than the novels, as none of the tension that exists in this storyline was there in the books. She just calmly strode into the city. This is much better storytelling. You could cut the tension with a knife. It was so thick. So my rating for Garden of Bones is a 9. Excellent. Another great episode with witty Tyrion scenes, and they explored more of Renly and Stannis' feud, as well as Arya and Daenerys' dire situations, making this another solid episode. So next is The Ghost of Harrenhal, which begins with a very intense scene of Renly being killed by the Black Smoke, a product of Melisandre's magic, which does indeed inform us that she does have some power. This results in Brienne becoming Catelyn's servant, a plot point that would become quite important down the line. And seeing Tywin arrive at Harrenhal would lead to many great scenes, as well as he makes Arya his cupbearer, and the chemistry between the two was amazing, absolutely amazing, and I think we get some of the best performances from Charles Dance as Tywin, as he scolds the other Lannister lords for being slack, what shows exactly the type of stern commander he is, which is amazing. And of course, we're also introduced to Jaqen H'ghar, as he tells Arya she can bid him to kill 3 people and he will do it regardless, sort of like a death genie. And she doubts him at first, but it's obvious there's something different about him. He even talks all weird, so I absolutely love this storyline and thought it was one of the best of the series. It was so satisfying seeing Jaqen make his first kill as he kills the Tickler, a man who was torturing innocent people, and to see Arya's face as she realized that he's totally legit was awesome. Other than that, we get a lot of setup scenes, like scenes setting up Tyrion using wildfire, scenes setting up with Stannis and Marjorie's next move will be, and scenes setting up Bran at Winterfell and the impending attack from the Ironborn, and other show drops with Zarazan Doxos as he proposes to Daenerys. So, my rating for The Ghost of Harrenhal is an 8, extremely good. The Tywin and Jaqen H'ghar scenes alone bring this episode up to a level of high quality, and the beginning with Renly's death was intense as well, but the rest of the scenes were mainly just set up. Not bad, but not great either. So next is The Old Gods and the New, where we get a lot more great Tywin and Arya scenes, such as when Tywin tells off Amerly Lorch for sending a letter of their troop movements meant for one of their bannermen to a Stark bannerman because he read it wrong, and he finds that Arya can actually read better than him. So they reminisce about their background as Tywin tells Arya a bit about how Jaime couldn't read and how weak his father was. These scenes were not just great just because of the chemistry the two of them had, but also because there was a sense of foreboding that Tywin may figure out who Arya really is. And then things do get intense, and when Lorch finds Arya out, so she has to desperately go to Jaqen for her second kill. And this was so great how Lorch opens Tywin's door so you think he's going to tell on Arya, but instead he just drops dead. I absolutely love that. And we get more flirting with Robb Stark and Talisa, and Catelyn disapproves when she sees this, as she warns Robb that he's promised to another. It's funny, the first time I saw this, it surprised me that the show actually remembered his promise to the phrase, as a lesser show would just wipe that under the rug and not really have that play a part in the future. However, the fact that this show is based off of novels may play a part in how it had to stay true to small details like that will actually become quite important later on. We get some more great interactions with Daenerys and the Spice King as she goes to him for ships, but predictably he's a dick about it. I love Daenerys' lines here about the dreams she had and her dreams coming true, and of course I love the smart assness of the Spice King as well. A lot of great lines. And I loved how he nitpicked her language, and she's just like, I didn't come here to discuss grammar with you. And she's like, no, you came here to take my ships. Again, love this guy. And then the stakes are raised even higher when Daenerys returns back to her room to find most of her Dothraki's servants killed and her dragons missing. This scene was so intense, I absolutely loved it. And of course there's the classic line where Daenerys screams, "Where are my dragons?" which I loved, but it gets a lot of flack, which I feel is entirely undeserved. Some feel it was over the top, but I totally disagree. I mean, the dragons are an absolute rarity in the world and by far the most important thing to her. Not only that, I think she really does liken them as her children, so her response is not one tiny bit over the top. It's incredibly appropriate. In fact, many complain she spends all seasons whining about her dragons. Okay, one, it's just 2 episodes, not all season, and 2, whining? Really? If your children were kidnapped, how would you feel if someone said you were whining about them missing? So honestly, I don't care what anyone says, this scene was absolutely amazing, and one of the reasons why season 2 is one of the best seasons of Game of Thrones. And we also got the epic riot in King's Landing in this episode, which is a result of Cersei's orders to disregard the common people and Joffrey overreacting to a little outrage, which blows into full-blown riot because of him, in which Sansa nearly lost her life. And of course, more epic was Tyrion bitch-slapping Joffrey, which he very rightfully deserved. Great scenes. And we get Theon's sacking of Winterfell, which is okay, but the best part was seeing him kill Sir Roderick, which was a really intense scene. Roderick's last words about Theon being truly lost were spot on and more right than he possibly could have known. So my rating for The Old Gods and the New is an 8, extremely good. The Arya stuff was amazing as always. The sacking of Winterfell had a rich sense of foreboding that raised the stakes, as did the riots in King's Landing, and an intense ending with Daenerys getting her dragon stolen was awesome. But what held this episode back to me was the Jon Snow scenes. Although getting the introduction to Ygritte was interesting, I had some major issues with these scenes, but I'll get more into that later on. So next was A Man Without Honor, and like most Game of Thrones episode titles, this has multiple meanings. As the line was spoken by Catelyn about Jaime Lannister, it also could be said to apply to Theon in this episode, as he shamelessly tracks down Bran and Rickon, or Parrot, Pre, and Zarazan Doxus as they enact their coup of Karth. So overall, this was an insightful episode as we get yet another great Tywin and Arya scene. Probably my favorite, as Tywin deduces that she's a highborn girl and Arya contemplates cutting his throat. Absolutely amazing scene as Arya tries to talk her way out of it. Just amazing drama. And then we get a great scene with Jorah and Daenerys as Jorah reveals just how much he loves her, and Daenerys is at her breaking point, puts Jorah in his place and asserts her power over him. Again, great drama. Hez was finding out that Pirate Priest stole her dragons, and that scene where he kills all the members of the 13, making Zarazan Doxus the king of Karth, was really intense. And most of the Theon scenes were kind of dull. However, the ending where Theon burns the 2 orphan boys and tries to pass them off as Bran and Rickon was really intense. We get one of the best "no" in TV history when Maester Luwin screams it as the 2 burnt bodies are revealed. That's just classic. But other than that, we get a lot of dull scenes in this episode, such as the heart-to-heart with Tyrion and Cersei. It was kind of pointless and out of character for both of them. And then Jaime kills kills his own cousin, to me making him an irredeemable prick. Oh, I can't be in prison because I'm a prestigious aristocrat, so I'll just kill my lowly cousin because he's not as important as I am. Seriously, fuck that guy. But what really brings this episode down is the Jon Snow and Ygritte scene. I suppose it sets up the type of relationship they'll have nicely, but it really does make Jon come off as too big of a naive idiot. In fact, for the first 2 seasons, the Jon Snow storyline was by far my least favorite, and I didn't appreciate Jon as a character at all, and part of the reason is that the show made him out to be too much of a moron. So my rating for A Man Without Honor is a 7, very good. Some intense scenes such as the coup of Karth, the most blood-curdling no I've ever heard, but some dull scenes as well, and the Jon Snow Ygritte stuff was just subpar. So next is The Prince of Winterfell, which sets up for the final 2 episodes nicely as it puts Stannis directly on the path to King's Landing. Tywin leaves Harrenhal in preparation for something, you don't know what, maybe it's to go after Robb Stark, but it was a great decision to leave this destination vague. Meanwhile, Tyrion prepares for the siege, Daenerys strategizes on how best to get her dragons back, Arya blackmails Jack and Hagar to enforce him to enact their great escape, and Theon gets a visit from his sister who isn't as supportive as he'd hope. So we also get the revelation that Bran and Rickon are indeed alive, which I think was the most obvious thing in the world, but still a touching scene when Osha and Luan talked about how Bran should have never known the 2 orphan boys were killed because of him, but he's overhearing this while he's saying it. And of course we deal with the aftermath of Catelyn letting Jaime Lannister go and how Robb is totally not okay with this and has her put under guard and states plainly that had she not been his mother, he would have executed her. Of course she let him go to bring back her daughters, but Robb's tempered response to this was Jaime Lannister has played you for a fool. And we do get some great scenes with Brienne whisking Jaime away. Meanwhile, Robb is more brazen with his love for Talisa as we get a romantic scene between the 2 of them that explains why Talisa's in Westeros, as she tells the story of a slave saving her brother's life when she was a child, where she promised never to live again in a place where slavery is practiced. That explains why she's in Westeros, because slavery is outlawed there, and also why she became a doctor. Plus, I think Catelyn's disloyalty played a factor in Robb disregarding her advice to stay true to his marriage plans. So this is where things started to unravel. So let me get into the Jon Snow stuff and why I hate it so much. I hated it before I read the books, but once I did, I hated them even more because the books give an example of this storyline being done properly. I can't believe how badly the show botched this storyline. The problem here is that Jon Snow comes off as a total incompetent idiot. As in the show, Jon is meant to kill Ygritte and instead lets her go, where she eventually leads him into a trap where he's captured by other wildlings. Meanwhile, Qhorin Halfhand and the others are captured while looking for Jon Snow. So basically, when Jon volunteered to go with Qhorin, he would have been better off had he said no, because, of the whole mission was a failure because of Jon Snow, and all of the men lost their lives because of Jon Snow. What an incompetent idiot! I mean, really, I honestly don't understand how the show expects me to root for such a moron. At this point, I was kind of hoping Jon would get killed. What a fuck up! Whereas, in the novels, Qhorin left Jon alone with Ygritte, actually hoping that he would let her live, and he actually felt proud of him when he did. And Jon, rather than stupidly letting Ygritte lead him into a trap, made it back to Qhorin and the group, and they got cornered by wildlings simply because the wildlings had the advantage that had nothing to do with Jon being incompetent. This was so much better. It didn't make me hate Jon Snow, but the show did. So my rating for The Prince of Winterfell is a 7. Very good. A decent enough setup episode, but nothing truly groundbreaking. So now we come to the golden crown of the season, and indeed perhaps the entire show, Blackwater. I cannot understate how blown away by this episode I was. This episode had epic battle scenes that I had never seen before on a TV show. This is the kind of thing I'd expect to see in like a Lord of the Rings movie. In fact, I think many people took this episode for granted as they were spoiled by the billion-dollar blockbuster movies and don't take into account how prohibitively expensive this sort of thing typically is for television. And those who have seen later seasons might be spoiled by watching those episodes later on when the show had a much bigger budget and they were able to do even grander battle sequences. But for this time, this was absolutely groundbreaking. However, it wasn't just the battle that made this episode great, as it had many amazing character moments, great dialogue, and awesome drama. This was the first time the show spent an entire episode in one location, which seemed particularly odd at this point in the series where the show had branched off into multiple storyline format, even more so than season 1. So this was exactly what the show needed, but the episode did branch into separate storylines at this one location. And the great thing about the battle and what sets it apart from like most movie battles you see, or even some of the battles you'll see later on in the show, is that there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. Both sides have their positives and their negatives, and if you do find yourself rooting for one side over the other, it's mostly a matter of perspective, and there's likely many others watching who would feel the other way around. Both sides have good, likable characters you can get behind, like Tyrion and Davos. Both sides have despicable, manipulative women pulling the strings like Melisandre and Cersei. Both sides have innocent, younger bystanders that only want what's best for their people like Sansa and Mathos. And on one hand, you have Joffrey, who stole the crown that rightfully belongs to Stannis by using despicable tactics and treachery, but on the other hand, you have a city full of frightened people who are afraid of being killed, raped, and having their possessions stolen by Stannis. So it's these clear shades of gray that make this battle so interesting. I cheered when Tyrion blew up Stannis' fleet with wildfire, as that was a cunning move, and I cheered on Stannis as he raided the shores and attacked the keep, because I would have loved to see him chop off Joffrey's head as he promised to do, and that makes for some complex and amazingly well done storytelling. In fact, I barely feel I even need to talk about the amazing wildfire explosion, which was truly one of the best and most exciting moments in the series. The quality of which it was filmed and put together is up there with the battle sequences done in much larger budgets, including those that came later in the series. But as I said, on top of this great action sequences, we also get amazing character moments, such as Davos' talk to his son just before he lost him, and the moments with Sansa and Cersei hiding and fearing for the worst, and how they it was quite telling as we learn more about how Cersei really sees the world. It was so awesome when Cersei mocked Sansa, "Ooh, praying to the gods to have mercy on us." Such a great little bit of acting. And yes, we get more witty Tyrion moments, like when Joffrey asks Tyrion what he's doing, and when he doesn't answer, he tells the Hound to tell Tyrion he asked him a question, to which Tyrion responds by saying, "Sir Lancel, tell the Hound to tell the king that the Hand is quite busy." Seriously, I was laughing my ass off. One of the best Tyrion moments of the entire series, and if not that one, then the rousing speech he gives after the Hound and Joffrey abandoning him and all looks as it's lost. He manages to give one of the best battle speeches I've ever seen on screen, which is a great moment for Tyrion's storyline as a whole, as this is the first time he actually is courageous in battle. And the ending of the episode with the battle montage, as Cersei tells Tommen a story that is meant to be inspirational, yet it's right before she plans to poison him and then herself because she believes all is lost. This was such an amazing montage, and I believe the best the show has ever done, especially the way it ends with Tywin bursting through the throne room doors and proclaiming that they've won. It made me want to get out of my chair and start yelling, "Yay, the Lannisters won!" until I realized, hey, wait a second, I hate the Lannisters. And again, that's awesome. It speaks to the complexity. So my rating for Blackwater is a 10, the best, definitely one of the best episodes of the entire series that was executed so brilliantly, not just for stunning action sequences, but great drama that was constructed so well to tell a truly engaging story. So finally, we come to the Season 2 finale, Valar Morghulis. This episode takes its title from the words that Jaqen H'ghar gave Arya to speak when she wants to go to Braavos. Of course, any Game of Thrones fans knows it's a saying in High Valyrian that means all men must die, as it would later become a common saying in the show. However, at the brief scene we get with Arya and Jaqen after her great escape, where Jaqen gives her the coin before changing his face, was a big deal, and it really blew me away. Those who were already familiar with the Faceless Men probably weren't as impressed, but at this time I had no idea that there were men who could change their face, let alone that Jaqen H'ghar was one of them. This magic just added to Jaqen's mystery very nicely. But overall, this was a great episode that wrapped up all the season's various storylines nicely. For one, we get the aftermath of Blackwater as we see the city praise Tywin as a hero that saved them all and completely ignore Tyrion's part. And thanks to the pact with the Tyrells who helped defeat Stannis, Joffrey set Sansa aside for Marjorie. And to see Tyrion's be injured, alone, and forgotten was sad, but we get an emotional scene where Shae shows that she does truly love Tyrion and pledges to stay by his side. And this transitions nicely to the scene where Robb Stark marries Talisa alone in the forest. It had a secret wedding vibe to it. Kind of reminded me of that scene from Braveheart where he got married in secret. And everything about it, the music and everything, it just worked really nicely. And we get the conclusion to Theon's storyline as he's surrounded by Stark bannermen alone and outnumbered, and gives a rousing speech to the Ironborn about going out fighting, and they simply beat him up, knock him out, and take him away. And Winterfell gets burned to the ground, and after the very touching death of Maester Luwin, Bran, Rickon, Hodor, and Osha are left to travel north to Castle Black. And we get an epic conclusion to Daenerys' storyline as she decides to go to the House of the Undying in an attempt to recover her dragons from the Warlocks. And this scene, these scenes were really creepy indeed, as Jorah and Dothraki go with her to the tower and they cannot find the entrance, and then suddenly Daenerys just disappears. There she experiences a bunch of visions. Now, those who have read the books were really disappointed by these visions, as they were drastically changed from the ones she experienced in the novels. However, some of these visions, while they worked in the written medium, if they translated it to the visual medium, it would have spoiled too much of the show. It would have gave too much away. But as for the rest of it, I believe the show had its own path that they wanted to foreshadow, which may not necessarily have been the same in the books. In fact, I think it was very telling, the scenes we got with Daenerys wandering through King's Landing, which was destroyed and covered in snow, and then finding herself traveling north of the wall. In fact, I believe these visions will become relevant again. However, I agree that the scenes were more interesting in the novel. I still think what they did for the show worked for the show. And the scene with Khal Drogo was mostly an excuse to bring this actor back. I kind of saw it as the Warlocks trying to trick Daenerys into staying there and not leaving, so I thought it worked well in that regard. Plus, it was really touching, the scene where she was forced to abandon Drogo again, and she once again said the line that Mary Mastor said about the sun rising in the west and setting in the east. And then the ending where she confronts the Warlocks and realizes her power is greater than theirs by getting her dragons to kill them was absolutely amazing. It's what her storyline had been building to all season, as she doubted herself and didn't know her strength and mostly just, kept breathing hot air. This is when she truly decided to have faith in herself and used it to kill the Warlocks and free her dragons. And then seeing her deal with Zarazan Doxos and his treachery by locking him and her treacherous handmaiden up in that big vault that turned out to be empty was so awesome, was a really exciting way to end the series. And of course, the episode ends with the epic scene where we finally clearly see the White Walkers for the first time as they surround Sam and march on the Fist of the First Men. This was such a chilling scene, particularly the way the horn blew 3 times and Grin and Ed just ran, abandoning Sam to be surrounded by the army of the dead. Such a chilling scene. So my rating for Valar Morghulis is a 10, the best. An amazing episode that ended the various storylines of Season 2 perfectly. So my rating for season 2 as a whole is a 10, the best. An absolutely amazing season, one of the best on television. Part of the reason why I think it worked so well, better indeed than many other seasons of Game of Thrones, is that it was very well paced and featured few moments that moved too slow or seemed like pointless filler. We got some of my favorite moments of the entire series with Tywin's, with Tyrion's wittiness and King's Landing, Arya's interactions with Tywin and Jaqen, and Daenerys' storyline how she learned her strength as the Mother of Dragons were all awesome. So now's the point in the video where I'm going to give a few observations on Season 2 on how it relates to later seasons. So if you haven't seen up to Season 6, you will want to turn off this video right here, otherwise you will be spoiled, so thanks a lot for watching. So the first observation I want to give is one of the low points of Season 2, and that is the burning of Winterfell, as it made absolutely no sense as it was presented in the show. I remember when I first saw it, I was so angry because it really made no sense. The way it was presented in the show was that Robb Stark's bannerman sent his son to retake Winterfell for him and offer terms that if the Ironborn surrendered, they could all return home except for Theon, who would be captured, and this would lead the Ironborn to turn on Theon and give him up, which is exactly what happened. So I'm confused, when in the fuck and why did Winterfell get burned? I was so confused by this at the time. I was angry, really angry, as this made absolutely no sense. I mean, why would the Ironborn burn Winterfell if they're going to give up, surrender to the Starkmen? You think the Starkmen wouldn't take too kindly to them freaking burning Winterfell? And why would the Starkmen burn Winterfell if they're on Robb's side? I just don't get it. It made no sense. So I thought this was handled very poorly in the show. Of course, we now know that Robb Stark's bannerman was Roose Bolton, and his son that he sent to retake Winterfell was the despicable Ramsay Snow, a man just as despicable as Joffrey, but more dangerous. So many tell me, in retrospect, we're meant to believe that Ramsay burned Winterfell down and had everyone killed. But why? Wouldn't that kind of give away to Robb that Roose isn't to be trusted? And of course, how the hell was I supposed to know? Because they didn't introduce Ramsay at this point in the show, and Roose was just some nameless advisor to Robb that kind of just popped up out of nowhere and was only in like 2 scenes. So yes, this was handled very poorly in the show. One thing I kept wondering while watching the scenes with Sansa being beat up and abused by Meryn Trant is if Arya is going to tell Sansa about the kind of ending she gave Trant, and if so, if that's going to get Sansa to appreciate Arya more. As if you think about it, the way Sansa killed Ramsay, the two of them aren't that far apart. Another thought that came to mind is that Robb's downfall with Meryn Talisa might have been foreshadowed a bit too much, as I think they were beating this, to death that this marriage was a really bad idea, as was crossing Walder Frey, but I feel this foreshadowing actually got worse in Season 3. And as satisfying as I found Maester Pycelle's death scene at the end of Season 6, I think overall I preferred the scene where Tyrion locked him up. Even though he received less bodily harm, it was more publicly humiliating, and that type of abuse I think was worse in Pycelle's eyes. However, after rewatching Season 2, I couldn't help but feel the fact that Theon went back to the Iron Islands is a bit unrealistic, considering how shitty they treated him, and he should have realized his huge mistake was betraying Robb and trusting in the Ironborn in the first place. I mean, his own men betrayed him and sold him to Ramsay, where he received the worst torture anyone could ever receive, so it doesn't really make much sense that he would go back to them. Okay, so that's it for my observations. That's all I have. So that's it for my review of Game of Thrones Season 2. I have a quick announcement. If you're watching this video after its first release, I will be doing another live Game of Thrones drinking game video in a couple days. This time I will be joined by Phil, the Issues Guy, and Max from Buzz Talks, as we will be watching a random episode of Game of Thrones, and we will play the Game of Thrones drinking game, and of course course, talk about Game of Thrones and observations on the episode as we get wasted. It's always a lot of fun, so I hope you can join us live for that. We're going to do that Friday, December 2nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the U.S., which will be Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. here for me in New Zealand. So please be sure to join us for that. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more Game of Thrones videos. Next week I will be doing my Season 3 review, and followed by the start of my Season 7 prediction videos the following week, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, and also many other videos I do on shows like Star Trek, Humans, The Walking Dead, Vikings, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.